I welcome you all. This overwhelming interest on the topic of today indicates an optimistic frustration about the state of affairs related with the gender imbalance in corporate boards. The persistent lack of gender diversity amongst key decision makers in large companies remains a cause for concern and further targeted action. UN Global Compact's Target Gender Equality Program aims to address this frustration. Today's Academy session is organized in connection with the Target Gender Equality Acceleration Program, which is focused on supporting companies to set targets and achieve gender equality outcomes, starting with women's representation and leadership at the executive, management, and board levels. So in the next 40 minutes or so, we will first expand the business case from a well-established correlation between gender diversity in the boards and financial performance to a wider perspective on the economically and socially desirable changes that a shift in the gender composition of leadership may bring. Second, we will discuss practical actions to deal with supply and demand side barriers for representation of women in the boardroom. And we have a fantastic panel that can reflect on experiences from different various constituencies. Last but not the least, we will conclude our conversation by turning the spotlight on the role of female leadership during the COVID-19 crisis, to rest the case for the expanded business case beyond the current crisis. And our distinguished panel includes Anne Dennison, the Senior Vice President and incoming CFO of NASDAQ, Irene Natividad, the Chair of Corporate Women Directors International, an organization that operates in many countries, Jeremy Awuri, the CEO of Absa Bank, Kenya, and Loti Salazar. Loti is the Corporate Governance Officer and leads the Women on Boards and Business Leadership Program in IFC World Bank. And my first question is to her. Loti, there's an upsurge of academic research and reports on the relationship between gender diversity in the boards and financial performance. The evidence on the correlation is robust, but the causality is contingent on many firm-level factors as well as cultural and institutional factors, such as the level of appreciation of their contribution, women's contribution, and the gender gap in the society. Recently, the focus has shifted to the impact of gender diversity on corporate behavior and non-market strategies. Women's presence is linked to social and environmental performance, board efficacy, and ethical behavior. In particular, how does gender balance at the board level impact gender equality performance of the company? What can you share on this with us?
Okay, thank you. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you to the Global Compact and my fellow panelists for this opportunity. Really very happy to be part of this event. So let me answer your question in two parts. Yes, there is a correlation between more gender balance and boards and in senior leadership and ESG. Our own 2019 research contributed to this growing body of evidence and revealed two sets of important connections. The first is that having more women in business leadership positions, including boards and C-suite, leads to higher ESG standards, with improved board performance, with a particular clear connection when women comprise a critical mass of about 30% on company boards. The second is that companies with enhanced ESG perform better on critical indicators, such as stronger internal controls and management oversight, reduced risk of fraud or other ethical violations, positive workplace environment, such as family-friendly policies, also enhance stakeholder engagement and improve reputation and brand. But there's a caveat to all of this, of course. To be effective, ESG strategies must be authentic, purposeful and intentional, meaning that they must be valued and practiced at every level of the company, hence the growing importance of a company's statement on purpose. All stakeholders must be able to identify themselves with a company's strategy and purpose. So truly, ESG needs to be central to a company's culture and become part of everything a company says and does. The good news is that companies are increasingly integrating sustainability practices, and this includes a growing number of companies committing to improve board gender diversity, but also enhancing their pipeline of female talent, garnering a level of support that was really unimaginable about a decade ago. And ESG is gaining traction as an investment strategy as well, especially given its outperformance during the pandemic. Evidence shows that gender-smart investment strategies can help grow a company's competitiveness, solidify its supply base, improve its workforce capital, and help build an overall sustainable business environment. Now, is it the board diversity or is it the presence of women that lead to better ESG performance? A very recent study I think it was launched a few days ago, reviewed companies in the Russell 3000 index to determine if women in C-suite positions improve board diversity. Conversely, if women on boards influence the number of women in other leadership positions. And guess what? The study found that companies led by women have more boardroom gender diversity than companies led by men. The study also found that 1/3 of gender-balanced boards have women CEOs. These findings reveal that women leaders create more opportunities for the advancement of women to top positions. So diversity really creates diversity. And I'm happy to provide the link to that report if interested. Thank you, Melissa.
Great, thank you, Lottie. Irene, I know that you're very passionate about the business case. Would you like to brief Lottie's comments?
Well, I have to tell you, Corporate Women Directors International did a bibliography of all the business case studies. There are now 91, and one pops up almost every month. And, you know, there was a point when I said, how many more times do we have to prove that having women in corporate leadership is a plus as opposed to a minus? Well, we do have to do it because McKinsey did a study on the business case, asking over 2,000 execs, what do you think about this? Well, 60% buy it. They understand the rationale behind it, but only 29% act on it. Because still a lot of corporate executives, mostly men at the top, think diversity is a social, cultural issue, political issue. They don't apply it to the bottom line. And so that's how come we need more and more of these. Now, 91 studies all point in the same direction, that return on assets, return on equity, risk mitigation, all improve when there are more women directors. But I want to be a little specific. There was anecdotally, there was a woman in an athletic shoe company board, and she kept asking them to asking management, develop a design a shoe for women and girls. And they said, oh, that's a good idea, but they wouldn't act on it. She kept pressing and pressing, and guess what? Of course, because at that time, they didn't think women were athletes, or that there were so many girls in the soccer fields, or that, women are jogging and are involved in sports. So in terms of creating a new market, a new product, having that voice of another gender matters. We did a report on the Fortune Global several years ago, and the #1 company was Albertsons. It's a pharmacy and supermarket chain. And at that time, their board was 50% female. And when I did the press conference, the CEO was with me, and he announced during his statement that he was adding one more seat. So now it was to be held by a woman. So now it's a female-dominated board. And he said, I do this because even my smart marketing men cannot get into the minds of the women who are the majority of my consumers. It's very simple. Right. It really has to do with who's your client. With women making 80% of buying decisions, a lot of loans, for instance, at banks. What you have to have that reflected on a board. As you
Right.
can all tell, I am an advocate for this. I've been fighting for 40 years for women in leadership, whether corporate or political. The evidence is there, but we need to keep repeating it.
Sure.
Because as Lottie and Belsa said, it's there,
Yeah.
but it's not heard necessarily.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Irene. Of course, despite the evidence supporting studies, let's admit one fact, corporate boards are crowded out by men, and they're frequently connected to social networks. How do you convince those already in power that a more diverse board is possible, beneficial, and legitimate? What are the arguments that you need to deal with, or you had to deal with, Anne? I'm asking to you. And how do you respond to resistance? Because if somebody will come in, somebody will have to go.
Yeah, thanks, Melsa. Excited to be here. So, what I believe that to really convince the folks in power that a more diverse board is beneficial, you need to show them the value proposition. And Lottie and Irene spoke about the dozens of studies that are out there around the positivity associated with a company's performance. So, but then that extends to attracting talent, getting away from groupthink and having innovation when you have a diversity of thought. And so we need to convince them of the value proposition there. But I think the other thing that is, I think, a powerful way to tell the story is that investors are calling for more diversity disclosures. So investors and asset managers, so BlackRock and State Street, they want their the companies they're investing in to disclose their diversity objectives and to disclose their statistics, and they're calling for that. And what we've seen, over the years is investors increasingly caring about, the broader ESG construct. So if you look back at, 2016, there was about 4 billion in asset flows into ESG focused strategies. If you looked at 2020, it was 10 times that amount, so 40 billion into ESG strategies. And so that's powerful. That's a powerful value proposition for having more investment in your company. So providing investors with greater transparency, serves to enhance investor confidence and really drive value in the company. I think one thing I did want to share is NASDAQ filed a proposal for board diversity with the SEC, for our listed companies, and so we did this at the end of December. And the goal of the proposal was really to provide stakeholders with a better understanding of, the company's current board composition and also to enhance investor confidence for the companies listed on our exchange that they're thinking about diversity. And so we're, asking for our companies to have at least 2 diverse directors on their boards, within a certain time frame, or if not, explain their rationale for not meeting that objective. And so I wanted to share that because, when we filed this proposal, we had predominantly a positive response, but there were responses that were not in favor, for a variety of reasons, whether it was they didn't believe, that we had the role here to mandate that, or that we would there would be an unreasonable burden on companies, as well as thinking about unintended consequences of our proposal. And so as we think about the sort of resistance there and the different perspectives, really we're trying to get a deep understanding so we can build consensus to move the narrative forward. But really, approaching, in our particular role, approaching this with, really a strong imperative to move from conversation, to action.
Right. Well, thank you, Anne. Well, I guess being convinced is one thing, but there is a conflict of interest, of course, with the incumbent board members. Therefore, I think the disclosure requirements and the publicly disclosed board policy, board diversity policy is fundamentally important to make sure that that is followed through. And I'd like to turn to Jeremy now. In our previous encounters, you said having women on boards is not something nice to have. It's a business necessity, right? So how did you justify it to your board? And what did you take into consideration when setting a target, gender diversity target for your board and perhaps for leadership? And how did you decide what the right target was? Because you have to be ambitious on one hand, but at the other hand, you have to be realistic, right? Can you take us through that process, your experience, please?
Yeah, sure. When I joined the board and the company in 2013, we had a very low gender diversity on the board, and it was literally as simple as, look, this doesn't make sense to me. We need to have more diversity in the company for all the reasons that have already been mentioned. It's a business imperative. To me, frankly, it's quite obvious. I'm not saying it's obvious to everybody because there are cultural biases that people have. But when it came to the thinking of what should the target be, it's quite simple as far as I'm concerned. We have 50% men and 50% women. So I don't see why the target isn't 50%. Trying to justify 15 or 20 or 25 or 30 really doesn't make sense. So in terms of our customers and consumers, there will be roughly 50%. We've heard about the purchasing decisions that are there, being made by women, whether formally or informally. So we just set that target. And then what we did is we then said, okay, look, if we had some retiring directors. We said, for us to get to that number, we have to bring women on board. So I just simply said, unless you bring and find me women who can do this job, we're not going to approve them. So it wasn't really optional in a way. And we found great women who really came to the board full of competencies and breaking any stereotypes that were there about their ability to add value to the company. And I think they became role models. And we very quickly, by 2014, we had 50-50 balance. I mean, in a previous job, I had 70% women and 30% men. So I've worked in that situation. So I think 50-50 generally works best, rather than any tilt one way or the other. And I think what it did is it also allowed us to attract more female talent, because people could see there wasn't a glass ceiling. We were committed, because you can talk all you like. And it's interesting listening to this conversation. We don't spend time doing a lot of analysis and looking for justification reports, with all due respect to those reports, because it's very easy to get caught up in analyzing things to death. I think for us, we know we have clients, they have needs. The needs of women are different than they are for men. Men have unconscious biases. We all think we know, we understand. But once you get those balances on the board, the types of conversations are very different. And what we seek to do is to listen to understand. And then from understanding, then we move to action. So we've set up, for example, we have a women's network forum, just 300-400 people, women on it. We encourage men. We've done the He for She program. We have programs where we work with many of our male colleagues, and we have honest conversations about their concerns, their worries, their stereotypes, like women should be at home raising their kids. And then you move on to conversations about flexible working, which are, where you're able to say, look, we are interested in output, not just people showing up at work. Yeah. So if they're able to manage their affairs, and it's interesting, COVID has actually really pushed that to another level, because we're all working remotely. So coming to work and showing effort doesn't necessarily equal results. And we've seen women doing very well in these environments where they're able to juggle both family, work commitments, working remotely. So for us, the evidence came through quite quickly in our business results. And then that fed off itself and started building even further, encouraging us to do more and more.
Right. Well, great. Talking about retiring directors, do you have a policy of a tenure limit, for example? Do they obviously don't decide on retiring themselves. So would tenure limitations, average board tenure limitations help? Who retires and why in your company?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak briefly about that. We have a policy which talks about the maximum tenures. So there is a policy about that. But what we also do is we do board director assessments. We assess each other and we assess the effectiveness of the board. And that's done every year. So it's very quick to see who is participating where. I think we're also contemplating more contract style arrangements, which make it easier. If you don't get certain scores or you don't participate, then whether you're male or female, you probably won't last long on the board because we all have to perform, whether we're employees, management, or board directors. So yes, we do have those policies and they generally work well.
Right. Well, thank you. I mean, maybe one note on the flexible working schemes. I think it's important to make sure that these flexible schemes are used by both men and women. Otherwise, you are crowded out by men working in the office and women trying to cope with both domestic work, unpaid, and also the official work. So a lot of companies these days do have flexible work hours, but making sure that they are equally distributed between female and male employees. Thank you. Irene, I'm going to come back to you again. I have two questions for you. Well, the first one is, can you please share your experience on nomination, right? Assuming that the board have set a target for female representation or gender diversity, what are some practical steps that can be taken to reduce bias in the recruitment process and expand the pool of candidates?
Well, first, I want to clone Jeremy because you need, I mean, as you're talking, Jeremy, I'm thinking, oh my God, I wish a lot of CEOs talked like him or like the former CEO of Albertsons. You need leadership at the top. You have to begin with that. Because if no one sees that the CEO or the chairman sees diversity as a value, it's not going to happen. So Lottie was mentioning, the corporate mission, if you will. And I think we have to begin there, that board diversity or diversity in general should be embedded into the company's overall mission. Nominations committees, I have to tell you, many companies don't have them in different parts of the world. In the past, before there were nominations committees, people got on the board because somebody thought it was a good idea. On the board I was on, I asked Tom, how did you get on this board? And he said, well, John thought it was a great idea. So that's how it used to happen. So one, you have to have nominations committees. Two, they should be charged with providing a diverse list to the overall board of any candidates that they would like the board to vote on. If you hire an executive search firm, you should tell them as well that any slate that they put forward must be diverse. And that's a charge that's not always given to search firms. If you want to keep us as a client, that's what we want. But only 30% of board openings are done by search firms. So it's within the company itself. So the nominations committee itself must have as its stated mission as a committee that board diversity is a priority. I have often thought, there's this world of highly competent executive women, and then there's this corporate world that wants to have women. They don't necessarily intersect. A lot of companies and even search companies don't know the networks in which executive women operate. And so that connection needs to be made. And Melsa, you asked a very important question of Jeremy. You have term limits. Most companies do not have term limits. So in order to refresh a board and bring in new talents and ideas, you must have a stated amount of time in which a board director can serve. After 10 years, and there are many directors who are there more than 10 years, they become part of management. And if somebody was a CEO 15 years ago, the world has changed. You need somebody else who's far more current. So the other recommendation we made in the National Association of Corporate Directors, no CEO wants to tell a board director it's time to go. Mm-hmm. Why don't you add a seat or two? This way, you don't have to wait for somebody to retire. But for some reason, there's a reluctance to open up a board. But that's certainly something that ought to be considered in order to make diversity happen. And Jeremy also said it well. You need a benchmark. You need a goal. You have to say it's 50% or 40%. You need a number and a deadline by which that goal should be achieved. Because without it, people will just say, of course we support diversity. And then it doesn't happen. They said, oh, we couldn't find a woman with mining experience who also understood marketing. Yeah. They'll find some category by which they couldn't find a woman. So I think those are the various ways that are quite practical and very doable. I used to say we should also have age limits, but people are living longer. So since I'm old myself, I gave that up. Term limits.
Well, maybe generational.
It's more doable.
Maybe in addition to gender diversity, we need to look into generational diversity as well. One of the research that I have published looks into different components, different dimensions.
Melissa, you're absolutely correct.
And generational diversity
a major.
is an important contribution as well. With the entrenchment, of course, there is a problem, especially with family firms, when the family members crowd out the board and they're there for life. And unless in the country there is a culture that the families, the owners actually lead their positions of power to professionals, you never have positions opening up. So I think there are different types of companies where board entrenchment is a major issue. And I guess the regulators have a role to play there by setting the tenure limits so that refreshment is in a way encouraged if it doesn't happen naturally. I said I'm going to have two questions for you, Arian, but I'd like to turn to Jeremy at this point about the candidates. Jeremy, a frequently mentioned limitation by companies in getting more women on board is the lack of capacity in certain industries. Of course, finance and especially in banking, this is not a limitation because the workforce is pretty diverse. But in some male-dominated industries, oil and gas, chemical engineering, well, I'm a chemical engineer, but I know that in my class, out of 80 students, I think we were 4. What should be the response? My personal view is that diversity in backgrounds also add to the resources of a company. So you don't really need to have all the board members coming from the same industry. And yet, perhaps just the opposite, that you need different perspectives, different ways of looking at the world, looking into this eroding boundaries between industries. But is industry experience, in your view, necessary for a board member?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that we go about it, and even the way that I run the company here, is I want diversity in general, whether that's diversity of background, ethnic diversity, gender diversity, because when you go to a point where you hire people like you, even if it's unconscious, you narrow down your options. Yeah, you narrow down your thinking, you narrow down the way you solve problems. And that can really cause your company not to deliver results over the long term. And frankly, you can even go out of business if you don't move with the times, fast enough. So I think for us, it's really, as you say, it has to be conscious. So, and it has to start consciously from a junior level, where we say, when we recruit, you must bring female candidates to the table. And that goes through to the senior level. If we're going to hire above a certain level, if you don't bring female candidates, then don't bring the candidates. Yeah, so you just have to bring them for us to see them. And I think the other thing we need to do is we need to celebrate those who are successful. So in my case, we run a bank. We want to bring candidates from all over, from FMCG, young, slightly older, from service sectors, because what do we want? We want to transform our bank into being truly customer obsessed, delivering real outcomes that change lives. So by having more diverse people on our board, we have ladies on our board that represent FMCG, that represent small and medium-sized enterprises. And what they do is they come in and say, look, buddy, you've missed the point. This is what the realities of being a woman and running a business actually are. And they give us feedback direct. And sometimes you swallow when you hear the feedback, but then you have to kind of check your ego and just say, okay, so how do we solve this? And right. Get on and solve it. So I think we have to have very specific right. actions, bring them on board. Yeah.
I'm now going to turn to Anne, and there is a question from the audience, which I think can be combined with the question that I'm going to ask Anne now. One of our participants, Van Myers, is asking whether low-level employees, not the C-level, can help advocate for these kind of changes in these organizations. I know that in NASDAQ you had a network of women, and I was curious to know whether they are also a kind of force to implement changes in the organization. Together with that, I have another question to you, so maybe you can also answer that. We have lots of reporting requirements, targets, and quotas, and that have been implemented in several countries, but while it is desirable for change, the stereotypes and organizational norms don't change that quickly. So, how can the organizations embed the values of diversity and equality into the fabric of their organizations? And maybe employees can play a role there, women's networks can play a role there. But who also should have the responsibility to ensure that once there is a policy, once there is a target, as Irene said, it all depends on the leader. If the leader believes in diversity, he implements it. What if Jeremy leaves and somebody else comes and that person has totally different views on whether the diversity is valuable or not? So who has to look for the continuity of those policies, sustainability of those policies? Who has the responsibility for oversight? Is it corporate secretaries, the CEO, the board members, regulators, exchanges, standard setters? So how do we see a complex network of stakeholders in a way being the oversight of companies' long-term commitments to diversity?
Thanks, Melissa. So I guess it's, from my perspective, pretty simple. The responsibility is shared broadly here. And so maybe we start with, the employees, so the participant question. So, as an employee of a company, as a stakeholder, you need to advocate for, your beliefs and as part of the culture. And I think that's an important element of what leaders need to look at in determining, what's important as they sort of set their diversity goals. When we think about, the broader responsibilities, so, we've got regulators and standard setters, regulators, maybe quotas, if that's appropriate. It's been successful in some cases, like in Norway. Standard setters, setting those disclosure requirements that really are going to, force companies to be transparent and also give, investors a view into what the objectives of the company are. Investors, asset managers, they have the responsibility of demanding that change and making companies, stand up and take a look at their statistics and work towards that success. But when your question on who in the company, so the leadership, the board itself, the CEO and the corporate secretary are going to be, instrumental in sort of making those things happen over time. They're going to get the external pressures, whatever they may be, and internal pressures from the employees. But the corporate secretary, and maybe I could share sort of NASDAQ has been on a journey here as well. And so, we are, an exchange, started as an exchange. We've been in a strategic pivot. And as we've thought about our board and, how to think about that long term, we've taken a real, sort of long-term perspective and tried to open up, I think, to Irene's comment before, to sort of move from, looking only for those candidates in the exchange space, but looking for, other perspectives, other industries that, might be complementary and help us, move our strategic pivot forward. And we've added, diverse directors to the board from that perspective.
Thank you, Anne. There are a lot of questions about the dissatisfaction with the binary nature of gender. I think maybe something should be said here, that the diversity means making sure that the best talent is utilized at the board level, whoever has this best talent. I think the focus on women is worth taking a broader policy perspective. This is my view, of course, interfering with the panelists' views, obviously, that systematic discrimination about 50% of the population leaves the best talent, best female talent out of the talent pool. This is obviously a business case discussion. And there are other questions from the audience asking for a more ethical perspective on the case for gender diversity. Obviously, inclusiveness, diversity, these are all ethically charged arguments for diversity if the companies are making decisions that have an effect on day-to-day businesses of companies that touch the lives of everyday men and women on the street. They have to have an understanding of what the citizens want and what the citizens needs to be offered. So inclusiveness is not, or diversity is not limited to just women. And not a specific binary representation of gender. Inclusiveness and diversity, I think, in general means that no talent should be overseen and no talent should be left out of making most important economic decisions that have an impact on everybody's lives. So let's say that we have set our targets, the women are on the board, what's the first step? But how do we make sure that we deal with the biases and the women's voice are heard? So I'm going to ask Jeremy again. So how did you make sure that with the change you had by increasing the female representation to 50%, how did you encourage an equal participation in the deliberations at the boardroom and dealt with the brotherhood or dealt with the legacy and prejudices related with stereotyping of women that they talk too much?
Yeah. What I would say is, I mean, when we added women to the board, they were very strong women, very forthright women, and expressed their views. So we had candid conversations. But I don't think this is just about women at board level. This is about women throughout the organization. I think it's about women through senior management. So even if you had a 50-50 board gender composition, if you don't have it going down the organization and women can't see that they've got a career and can be able to move up in the organization or can balance their own lives in a way that works for them, you're going to end up with lower engagement. So we had very specific programs. As a general cultural approach within the company, we like to talk about issues and create an environment where you can express yourself. Yeah, the things that frustrate you. We've got the Women's Network Forum, and you'll never find such a charged environment. I always tell them when I come to meet these women, it's the highest energy environment that you can find. So I always say, if I could get 50% of that energy into the remaining men, then we will definitely pick up our performance, not taking anything away from men. But I think we also equally spend a lot of time talking to men about their biases, about their beliefs, and about their struggles, because a lot of these, as we've said, come from your background, come from your ethnic origin, and we talk about it. And some people say, I struggle to sit across a lady who's giving me a hard time, or I struggle to performance manage somebody who's asking me questions. And then what do? We can set up coaching sessions, support sessions, where they come around at this. And it doesn't even have to be about work specifically, just the nature of having the conversations we find changes things. So the He for She program is particularly good, but we make sure we look for quick wins also. So we've got specific programs that lend to women-based entrepreneurs, and we make strong commitments. So for example, I made a commitment that we would train 10,000 women entrepreneurs to take their businesses international. And we are already at 5,500 businesses. So once we have those and people see those and they participate in the conversations, I think the confidence grows that this is not a charity case. This is not we're being dragged kicking and screaming to achieve a quota. This is about, hey, these people actually, by bringing in diversity, we actually get business results and we enjoy our work better and we have higher engagement scores. Because the reality is today it's a challenge to engage your employees. A lot of companies have very low engagement scores. And guess what? Why is that? And gender is just one aspect of that we need to tackle, and we do.
Right. In general, we know that the quotas work, but there are different approaches to quotas as well. For example, in the European Union, the quotas largely apply to non-executive members, and there are a lot of questions about, of course, the executive levels. But what we see is that the percentage of women at the board level keeps increasing because of the quotas, but the percentage of female CEOs stay where it was for 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So we have a problem in getting women into executive positions where their impact on the HR policies, the work-life balance, all the issues that are relevant to getting more women into the economy, they don't seem to be addressed that way. Countries within the EU, there are a lot of participants from the EU countries. Those that have a quota, they reached 36.5 from 10% in 2012, and those that don't have any quotas, they remained at 16%. So obviously quotas help to move the top talent, and we do expect that to be reflected. But there is a gap between getting female representation at the board level to their impact on the organizational culture and organizational norms. In some countries like the UK, represented by the 30% club, the peer pressure seems to work. So without a quota, UK also moved from 12%, 11% to 30% representation of women on the board. But especially in countries where there are no significant pressure from the institutional shareholders, less developed markets, not efficient markets, especially emerging economies, developed economies, comply or explain doesn't work, but the quotas are also difficult to implement. So I'm going to ask Anna again whether the current incentives are sufficient to accelerate the pace of change for board diversity. What is actually working? And with your announcement last year, what should companies expect to see from other exchanges and investors? Is there something going on within the Federation of Exchanges? Would it be something that would be in a way traveling to less developed, less efficient markets where institutional investor pressure is a little bit less effective? Disclosure requirements, stock exchange listing requirements, investor requirements, peer pressure advocacy. What is your vision for the future? What is that you see is going to determine the response of the boards to the demands for gender diversity from various stakeholders?
So on the pace of change, so the pace of change has been slow, right? Slower than all of us would have wanted it to be. But I think I believe we're at a pivotal point. There's so much focus now, on issues of gender and diversity in general, right? So with, the Me Too movement being part of it, as well as, the events of 2020 and, the pandemic and the events in the US, really putting the spotlight on, the need for focus here. And I think that's really elevated the dialogue and hopefully will help accelerate the pace, the pace of change. And we're seeing, maybe not a broad movement. I haven't seen any other exchanges with similar proposals, or at least in the US, I should say. But we have seen, like, for example, like Goldman Sachs announcing at the end of last year that when they're taking a company IPO, unless there's a diverse member of the board, that they won't participate in that IPO. And so we may, start to see more traction there. I mean, there's certainly tons of dialogue in the regulatory space on this, and in the US in particular, we have a new SEC chairman coming in who's got a very strong focus on ESG in general. So expect that collectively, with the momentum that we have and all of the focus and the focus from investors, we'll start to see the change moving hopefully at a faster pace than we've seen over the last 10 years.
Melsa, I'd like to add to that.
Sure.
Our audience probably doesn't know there are now 44 countries with quotas for women on corporate boards. And that includes countries like Malaysia, United Arab Emirates, Panama, diverse countries. And this has accelerated. And what quotas are accelerants. And the quota laws only promised that it would increase the number of women on boards. It didn't say, those laws do not promise that it will also mean lots of women downstream, okay? Yeah. So of course, advocates like me hope that that would be the case. Norway, as Anne mentioned earlier, got their quota in 2003. By 2013, there were no women CEOs, no women in senior exec in big numbers. And so everybody said, see, quotas don't work. Well, today, Norway has 16% of their big companies headed by women, 26% in senior executive roles. And yes, they reached their 40% women on boards. So just remember that it took centuries of male leadership. Quotas are very recent. And so they're not going to change culture overnight. But it is an initiative, as you said, Melsa, that's effective. In terms of disclosures, there are now 33 countries that now have gender diversity into their corporate governance code. 10 years ago, it was like this many. So there is momentum, as Anne is saying, but we need to be vigilant to make sure that they continue.
Thank you. I was going to ask your view on that anyway, so thank you for jumping in and offering your views. Great. Well, there are, of course, some other questions here, and I'd like to turn to Lottie before asking her a question that was in my list. But before that, I have another question for Lottie, an interesting comment, and I love that. Karima Abid is asking, when we look for women to fulfill the boards, are we really also considering the leadership paradigms, the masculinity of the leadership? So what it means to be a leader, and how do we associate masculine characteristics with leadership? How do women's traits actually contribute to board's workings and the board's decisions? Because when you look into how gender diversity is considered to be beneficial, and what type of leadership changes or changes in the leadership style are to be expected, in many conferences that I have participated, collaborative working, egalitarianism, stakeholder orientation, a future perspective of the world, so many different attributes were mentioned. And performance orientation and performance focus, which is a masculine trait, was never mentioned with that. And I know that in the leadership, in the training programs that you have for boards to make best use of female talent, you are looking into that. Can you tell us a little bit about the differences between the styles and values of female and male leaders? Is it something that we need to consider when we are discussing the business case for gender diversity?
I just wanted to add, and well, first of all, second the comment by Irene that we should definitely clone Jeremy in every which way, because we need more allies like Jeremy. We talk a lot about the strategy of promoting and having more male allies, because really it is the tone at the top that will help establish and promote and implement many of these policies. Because at the end of the day, beyond the moral imperative, beyond the ethical imperative, it is about companies reflecting the markets they serve. If they don't, then we will continue to have a very slow pace of progress, if at all. The second thing I wanted to add to what Irene was saying as well, and you, Melsa, is about the Scandinavian countries. Yes, the quotas have worked and they're working more. But we gave a presentation early last year before the pandemic came upon us, to a group of young professionals from Nordic countries. And we did quite a bit of research then. And of course, the quotas were pushing women, the number of percentages of women on boards, but not so at that time. And that's been changing a little bit, CEOs and other positions of leadership. And we were wondering, these countries have wonderful social welfare policies. They have all the, parental leave, you name it. However, if you start digging more, you realize that many women still don't have access to capital. Many women in the Nordic countries still don't own businesses. And despite their wonderful welfare policies, not necessarily all men executives take that leave. And so the onus is back on the women, because if the father is not taking the fabulous leave that they have, well, somebody has to still look after the children. So we also need to look at those things. And we were discussing these things with these young professionals, and all of this came out. And many of them also didn't realize that. And it was very interesting, the comments we had after the presentation, because they came to us and he said, you know what? I'm going to have to double think some things that I was planning to do, but because I didn't realize, because they're sheltered in a way, right? They grew up with all these the best countries to live in, and then where women are the most advanced, etc. But when you start digging in, it's always not rosy. That's what I'm saying. Although of course we look forward to achieving those successes.
Yeah. Well, let's come to what we're dealing around the world today, the COVID situation. So COVID has set back women's participation in the labor market. A lot of women had to leave the workforce. Our recent research in Turkey also showed that domestic violence has increased tremendously, because men and women had to work in small spaces together. And the workload, the domestic workload on women, even if they're both working, have increased a lot. But on the other hand, while the women have experienced the disadvantages of the pandemic, and they are always experiencing the worst part of any crisis or any negative situations in the economy. At the same time, the response of women leaders has put a spotlight on the value of women's leadership. So how do you think that the crisis and our experiences of how female leaders behave during the crisis, for example, we know that companies with female CEOs have laid off much less employees, so they kept their workforce intact, and many other comparison between how they responded to crisis really puts women under the spotlight as dealing with it better. So how do you think the crisis will impact our efforts to advance more diversity in the future? And what lessons do we take from the COVID situation, COVID crisis, COVID-19, novel COVID-19 crisis?
Okay, thank you, Melsa. I have to say, in the last year, I've learned a lot from women business leaders about the impact and how they pivoted and steered their companies through the crisis. So indeed, the pandemic has had a tremendous impact on women and girls, as you say, particularly in the labor market and on gender-based violence. I mean, and that topic alone, we can spend a whole hour, if not more. It has exposed, though, the fragility and vulnerability of the corporate sector, accelerating the push to adopt sustainable business models that are increasingly demanded by investors and consumers alike. And that's something that Pam and Jeremy referred to earlier. And women leaders in the private and public sector have stepped up to the challenge, as you indicated, Melsa. I mean, we all saw how women leaders in New Zealand, in Germany, in South Korea, and other countries were praised for the strategic response to the pandemic. And with our own Women in Business Leadership program, we have seen women leaders navigate, I mean, really profound social, financial, and technological change, adopt new tools, adapt to new regulations, and try to create a culture of inclusivity in which everyone can thrive despite the crisis. So here I would like to plug one of our upcoming publications, and there's a point for doing that. We are in the process of producing video interviews with women leaders from around the world, along with a guidance note on lessons learned on leading through crisis and recovering stronger. And Irene was kind enough to be one of our peer reviewers. Women leaders have shown strong leadership traits, and we were talking about this earlier, Melsa. They've shown, among many other traits, resilience, drive for results, creative innovation, agility, stakeholder focus, emotional intelligence, caring, grit. Recently updated research shows that women in leadership positions are every bit as effective as males, if not more. In fact, they were thought to be more effective in 84% of the most frequently measured competencies. And there is a study about this. In some very clear examples of the many, I mean, thousands, I'm sure there are out there, of these women leaders at work, include a vice president in Pakistan, for example, whose family business had to shut down its factories around the world at the height of the pandemic. But they managed to retain all 23,000 workers and even donated money to pay for their food, healthcare equipment, and PPEs. Another example I can think of is of a CEO in Indonesia who shares that despite the decline in ridership, her ride-hailing company never shut down. So they pivoted to take advantage of the surge in deliveries, like many other organizations have done, and they have provided a venue for the wives of the drivers to sell their food. At the pandemic's height, a technology company in East Africa, led by a woman CEO and board director, delivered critical banking solutions to cities and rural areas while addressing the spike in demand for services and keeping workers safe. So you wonder, if women can make such good leaders, why do we have so few? So few parliamentarians, so few heads of state, definitely women on boards. I mean, the percentage is increasing, but nowhere near what we would like. Percentage of CEOs is what, 4 or 5% globally. Percentage of CFOs is 5-6 globally percent. So is it unconscious bias? Is it cultural norms? Lack of mentoring or networking, stereotypes, all of the above? The bottom line is really that companies need to move past traditional leadership traits and embrace diversity and change by engaging all stakeholders and with intention and purpose, as I mentioned earlier. So this inclusive thinking requires a new mindset on what it means to lead. Companies need leaders who value diversity and inclusion and can recruit, retain, and promote talented employees with different experiences, skills, and backgrounds. And luckily, we are seeing a growing number of progressive companies looking outside of the typical sources of top talent recruitment as a result of the pandemic. But it really does take a holistic approach. It's not just what the companies can do, it's what the boards can do, what regulators can do, what women themselves, women can do. So it is a holistic approach that we need to take to promote and increase the diversity and inclusion in companies around. Thank you.
Thank you, Lottie. So I guess we have to now wrap up and close because we have run out of time. So what are the key takeaways from this session? I think first of all, the last words of Lottie were quite important, that Yes, of course, we know that legislative quotas or self-regulation with strong government encouragement are the only way to untap the potential of skilled women at the board level. And we learned that we should look at leadership from a totally different perspective, from the perspective of what type of leadership we need actually to meet the challenges that the humanity is facing today, represented in the Sustainable Development Goals of the development agenda. But whatever the companies do with the regulators and the governments to improve the diversity, we need structural reforms for women to effectively participate in the labor force, so that the improvement at the board level is filtrated to the executive management at every level, and the pipeline is not leaking. And these reforms should come from the governments, but I think a role for business leaders is to support them and advocate for those reforms, to have effective participation of women and those who can't access the employment in a better way through structural reforms. These reforms should include reducing the gender pay, improving the accessibility of quality childcare and elderly care, providing incentives for companies to adopt gender diversity policies at all levels of decision making, and most importantly, adopting a culture of gender equality. And that is something that the governments and public policy efforts should need to, of course, focus as well. So what we have come up with is on the screen, our key takeaways: that the business case for women's representation and leadership is established, and the focus is now moving from financial outcomes to non-financial outcomes, which may at the end, of course, lead to financial performance. And there were a lot of practical advices in terms of how representation can be promoted, supported, and implemented, both from supply side, addressing supply side barriers and demand side barriers. And of course, we also talked about the experiences that we had during the COVID-19 pandemic, that we see a different view of female leadership that is socially beneficial to everyone. So businesses, governments, investors, stock exchanges, and employees and citizens, we all have to play a role to promote the ideals of equality and representation at all levels of decision-making, economic decision-making, political decision-making. So, these are our key takeaways from this session. Fantastic panel and very, very good questions. Some of them we couldn't address, sorry about that. So I'd like to suggest you to take a look at those resources that we present on the screen. You can find the links to those resources, and at the time in the chat you will also find a feedback survey, and we ask that you please let us know what you thought of today's session. What did we do good? What we could have done better? I also encourage you to learn more about target gender equality and consider participating in the program in 2021. In 2021, Target Gender Equality is doubling its geographic footprint and will be offered by Global Compact local networks in over 40 countries. Please make sure to check back on the UN Global Compact website in March to sign up. Once you set the targets, it's easier to move forward. And also, please do join us on March 16 at Target Gender Equality Live featuring a dynamic mix of live plenaries, on-demand programming, global networking, and practical tools and resources. Registration is free for all employees of UN Global Compact companies. If your companies are not members, do encourage them to sign up, become a member company. And we call on you to especially encourage your male colleagues and team members to join in the conversation. Thank you all, and good night to some, good morning to others, and good afternoon to some others. Lovely session. Thank you for our panelists as well.
Thank you, Melsa. Thank you, everybody.